Now there is more you should know about variables. For example, you sometimes have variables that never change. Of course, technically it's called variables because the value is variable, but in the end it's all about having data containers, and those data containers could also be set once and never change thereafter. For example here, I never assign new values to start and end alignment. And if you know that this is the case, it's recommended that you use final instead of var. Final is another built-in keyword, which simply means that this data container will never receive a new value. And whilst you could of course stick to var, it's always a good practice to be as restrictive as possible so that you never accidentally reassign a value here. Of course, you're the only one working on this project here probably, but in bigger teams with multiple developers working on the code, you want to be as restrictive as possible to make sure that some colleague of you is not accidentally overriding one of your variable values somewhere else in the overall project code. That's why the final keyword exists. Now here I'm of course getting some blue squiggly lines that I should use const instead of final in the end. And indeed, that's another usage of const which we haven't seen up to this point. You can create so-called constant variables or constant data containers, you could say. It's almost the same as final because const also makes sure that you can't reassign those variables, but unlike final, it provides some extra information to Dart. When using const here in front of a variable name, so on the left side of the equal sign in the end, you're telling Dart that the value that's stored in here is a so-called compile time constant, which means it's simply locked in at the point of time this code is compiled. Now that's not necessarily always the case. You could, for example, also have some code where you're maybe calling a function, get alignment, which doesn't exist in this project, but which could exist, and which then behind the scenes could dynamically calculate the desired alignment. You could definitely have something like this in your application, and if that's the case, that of course means that this function must be executed when the app runs to get the actual alignment value. In that case, it might still be final. You don't reassign the variable thereafter, but it's not compile time constant because the value that might be returned by get alignment is not known at the point of time when this code is compiled yet. Instead, it's only known once the code executed. And here that's different for alignment top left. This indeed is locked in at the point of time this code is compiled. Top left is clearly defined to the top left corner of the device, so to certain x and y coordinate values, and therefore you can use const to tell Dart that this is not dynamically derived at runtime, but can be locked in and set at compilation time. And this is another potential performance improvement because if some value can be locked in at the point of time the code is compiled, this code doesn't have to execute when the app executes. Instead, this locked in and internally saved value can be used by Dart when this code is about to execute. So it's some internal performance optimization, and therefore here, when defining variables, you should also use const instead of final whenever it makes sense. So whenever you have such a compile time constant value. And just as before, the code editor will simply tell you when you have such an opportunity. By the way, with that set to const, you can also re-add const down there in front of box decoration, because now that this is const instead of var, you guarantee that it will never be reassigned, and therefore you can use const here because this code is now no longer potentially variable because it can't be set in any other place. It can only be set once, and therefore here we can unlock this potential optimization of the box decoration object again. And in case this is all not 100% clear just yet, you will see variables and final values and constants over and over again throughout this course, but it is important to be aware of these concepts right now already because we'll use more variables in the next lectures.